More on this, let's bring in Iraqi war veteran and Republican strategist Chris Neiweem. Chris, good to see you, and I wonder what you make of that. As Rich was just reporting, the U.S. doesn't necessarily want regime change in North Korea as the first option, but I spoke to Ambassador John Bolton a couple of days ago, and he said it's looking more and more like diplomacy is not going to work when you see these Chinese ships bringing oil into the regime in North Korea, for example, that the sanctions from the UN, a mockery is being made of that. Are we more likely to see war in 2018?
I don't think so at this point. I think there's more options to be done. It's a winding staircase. It's probably the most precarious foreign policy problem for the United States. Our whole government, our leadership team, it's a problem. I think that there's more leverage to be achieved with China. I think they need to put down those sanctions. These oil transactions shouldn't be happening. I think in the short term, the Olympic opportunity, the Olympic Games, the opportunity for the North and the South to have some sort of communication there to sort of ease tension slightly. But I think the president's been setting the right tone of saying we're not going to accept the things that they're doing, and they need to relent.
But when you talk about other options, what are those other options then, short of war?
Well, I think that we can economic pressure in the region. I mean, China needs to tell them that they can't do those things, and we need to show of force. But I think that Kim Jong-un, he doesn't just have a really bad haircut. I think he's afraid of the U.S. I think it's mutually assured destruction. I don't think he's going to do anything, but the economic pressure is the only last option before we, go from there.
Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about Iran as well. We've got these twin threats: North Korea, Iran, and in fact, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was on one of the Sunday talk shows talking about these protests. Watch.
President Trump is tweeting very sympathetically to the Iranian people, but you just can't tweet here. You have to lay out a plan, and if I were President Trump, I'd lay out a plan as to how I would engage the regime.
Lindsey Graham's close friend John McCain has long said, and I was covering Barack Obama at the time, that in 2009, when we saw those protests during the Obama administration, some of the protesters in Iran were saying, Obama, Obama. They wanted more leadership from the U.S., and they didn't get it. What more can President Trump do this time?
Well, I think continuing to endorse those types of movements to get them to get to the size and scope of back in 2009 is doing the right thing. But ultimately, I think we need to try to phase out the Iran deal and phase in a new deal with freezing more assets and putting that back on. You know, the Obama administration, they tried, but it wasn't successful. We essentially paid for a deal that didn't work. They're still bad. They're still doing bad things. It's still a theocratically run government. So I think endorsing those revolutionary forces and protest forces and getting a new deal in place.
Yeah, you make an important point that the president campaigned against that Iran nuclear deal, called it a disaster. He's had a chance to decertify it, but they've been careful not to pull the trigger on that just yet. But in reflection, I guess a two-part question, how absurd was it, frankly, for the last administration to give $150 billion, essentially, to this regime in Tehran when the economic gains are not getting their own people? We were essentially propping up that regime. And now what does President Trump do forward when Lindsey Graham says we need a plan? What are 2 or 3 things you think he can do?
Well, I think that the first thing he can do is continue to endorse those protest forces and empower them. And we can try to do things like encourage the social media on the ground level and those sorts of things. I agree with Senator Graham that we need to get a plan in place, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And where I disagree slightly is, being an Iraq war veteran and with the VA and still a lot of issues with health care and these things, we cannot have a flash to a war before we exert all those other options. So I think putting more asset freezes in place and essentially going back on some of those earlier commitments for the deal and making a new deal. And I think that could take a few months, but I think that's what the president's best option at this point.
Well, the president returning today from Florida to Washington, as you suggest. A lot of hot spots around the world that will be dominating coverage in 2018. Chris Neiweem, we appreciate your service. We appreciate you coming in today.
Good to be with you.
Happy New Year.